everybody. Welcome to the second lecture on Murders in the Rue Morgue, subtitled The Monkey Done It. You may notice that I haven't put a little outline of this lecture or talk at the bottom of beneath my picture this time, because I'm going to use the text of the announcement that I had posted called The Monkey Done It. And I've added to that announcement in this document. So when I go past what you can see on your screen, you may need to scroll down, but just go ahead and do that. Follow along. I'm going to freeze my picture as usual so that you don't have to watch me and you can just listen to me for whatever good that is, okay? So I don't know why I'm so taken by the whole concept of the monkey done it and why I think that's so funny. Maybe I just like to say things like that. But it got me thinking about how rich this story is. I mean, how it's such a mine. You know, in some ways, it's not an outstanding piece of craftsmanship. There is some really cool stuff. But, you know, as Poe goes on in the story and he's telling all the, you know, sort of reciting the quotes from the different people who were witnesses who ran it, you know, came into the scene right after the murders. You know, he he makes sure that you don't miss that point about that nobody, when people say they thought it was a language, they're always talking about a language that they don't know. And it's kind of like, get it? Get it? Do you get it? How about now? Do you really, really get it? So that's a little heavy-handed, and there's a couple of other things that seem kind of lacking, you know, in the story. I'm not, you know, I don't want to. I'll talk about this a little bit later too. I'm not trying to, you know, split hairs here, but for example, we don't have any idea why Le Bon is arrested. That never makes it into the plot. You know, and some of the kind of, you know, minor details like how the heck did this guy keep a monkey, this arboreal animal fed, or know what it was supposed to eat? You know, these are minor details, but they're also something that I'm going to talk about later. That you know, in this kind of storytelling, that sort of thing is not as important. So let's go back to this idea of, you know, well, why do we have an ape murderer as opposed to an ex murderer? And when I first thought it, I was like, come on, what a bunch of baloney. But then, as you look at it more, I really think that we're on to a couple of really key points. Particularly at the time when Poe is writing, he's trying to appeal to a readership that includes polite society. That doesn't mean the polite society doesn't buy popular fiction, but what I'm saying is that some of the things that he writes about, which would come out of more lurid types of writing, you know, things that describe death. There are things that talk about the, you know, horrible mutilations and things like that. Those were not the kinds of things that respectable people would necessarily pick up. Any idea about, you know, any idea that it was common that normal people could suddenly go berserk and kill each other, you know, it was a little harder to tell that story in the context of a magazine that you might have in your living room, particularly, you know, at the era when he's writing. So he has to, there's a lot that he really has to do, a lot of kind of maneuvering and negotiating in order to tell the story of these horrible murders. And one of the things he does is he makes the murderer, the killer, the other. And that's an other with a capital O. You're going to hear that term a lot over the course of the semester. When the other is that which we define as not us. When we talk about the terrorists, for example, this is a term that we use to turn people into others. You remember when we talked about the certain factions within Afghanistan. These guys were freedom fighters, and the other people were terrorists. And I'm not making any political commentary here at all. All I'm pointing out is how we use language to include or to separate. And it's one of the most powerful activities that we do with language, and we do it all the time. Well, a murderer is already other. There is no question, because you transgress that line, you cross the line between acceptable and unacceptable. But what Poe does is he pushes it another step farther. Okay, he makes the murderer, and you really kind of have to put it in quotations, actually a beast. So in some ways, and this isn't something that I mentioned in my announcement, but in some ways, he's also commenting on what we become when we kill. When we transgress that line and we kill and I noted in the announcement that in general, murder becomes reprehensible. Killing another human being turns into murder when we do it for greed or gain or out of some kind of perverse enjoyment of other people's suffering. There are circumstances under which we accept that it is necessary to kill another person, and or in certain cases self-defense, or the defense of one's children or family, or something. There are you could probably bring these to mind. Okay, but he's talking. I mean, it's in some ways very symbolic that the murderer is a beast, because that's basically where we end up. Is these murders are bestial, and so of course the monkey done it, right? It's comforting that, I mean, we can look at this murder, we can accept it. It's almost like a traffic accident. Oh, how horrible! I mean, we're horrified that these things occur, but we say, well, it was an accident. It was an accident. In this particular case, it wasn't somebody's. It wasn't another person maliciously plotting to rob and rape. There's always, when you find women with their hair torn out, lying dead and stuffed up a chimney, there's that. Even though rape isn't mentioned, that's the elephant in the room in this story. That's it's the women lying on the bed, so they can be examined is also a very powerful image. It's one that's titillating, and I'll talk about that in a little while in the section called Cherchez la Femme. But it's comforting for the readers to come back to this. Well, the monkey done it, and this isn't a human thing. No human would go this far. Now, there's another point that I made in the announcement, which I think is very, very useful to look at, because it's a thing that it's another one of those elephants in the room, and this really plays strongly on the prejudice and the just completely inculcated, like down in the blood beliefs of I don't want to say the majority of Westerners, but certainly at the time when Poe is writing, a very sizable number of people felt that foreigners, particularly those from Africa, Latin America, China, Japan, some pushed it to Russia, those people, particularly those who looked different, those people weren't really people. At best, they were children. At worst, they were beasts. If you, any of you who may have read a lot of the literature that comes out of pro-slavery governments and societies, will read that the sort of more benign thing is it's our job to take care of these people while defrauding them of their lives and everything. But minor point. But it's our job to take care of these people because really they really need us. They need us to civilize them. But on the other hand, you also get to the rhetoric that has been used the world over many, many times, I'm sorry to say, which is these people are different, they're evil, the evil in the world is their fault. We need to exterminate them. And you can probably draw a million, or not a million, but probably draw many, many examples to mind from ancient times up through modern times, including our own the United States interaction with the Native Americans. And there were many people who said the only good Indian is a dead Indian. That's a direct quote. I'm not making that one up. And my apologies for even saying the words to those of you who may be Native American or have Native American relatives. But it's true. I mean, this was a mindset. So this is how this creature in the story, the monkey, he's not a monkey. I'm sorry, I keep calling him a monkey. He's an ape. They are great apes. And they're supposed to be the smartest, by the way, so some of this is kind of plausible. But this is another level on which the ape functions. He is a foreigner. He is a stand-in. He represents the fears that we have about, not we, but the fears that Poe and Poe's society had about the foreign and the alien, and yet we are attracted to it. We are interested in it. It is exotic. It's different. The other is always going to be a two-sided coin. We're always going to be when we come to looking at who is the other in whatever story we're talking about, we see that there is attraction and repulsion. It isn't just, oh, I hate this, I can't look at it. It's, I hate this, I must look at it. So that's another level on which this ape functions, and I think it's a fascinating one. You know, at one and the same time, it's a way of completely distancing the reader from the crime and the criminal, and kind of reasserting that, you know, crime and violence is the product of the other. We wouldn't do that. Of course it was an ape. But at the same time, it's also a cautionary, almost a cautionary thing that says, yes, we are compelled to read the other, to trap that orangutan and bring him back to France. But this is what happens when you bring the other into your society. There is a wildness. There is a zone of no control where anything might happen, like women getting murdered in the beds. Okay. Now, I also talked about, like, on a narrative level, how the ape murderer functions. I did point out earlier, by the way, that he isn't named. And this is, anybody who's read Frankenstein knows that this is a common way of othering, something that the Nazis did to the Jews when they put them in the concentration camps, is that they took away their identity cards, anything that would mark them, and they put numbers on them. Not naming, a refusal to name something, is a way of making it other, because we function by names. We have names that we pick, names that we're born with. They mark where we came from, where we want to go. Their names are incredibly powerful. This creature has no name. I mean, if he'd been like, you know, Hutton's King of the Jungle or something, he just wouldn't have had the same narrative impact. He is merely the ape. But he also serves a good narrative function in that his presence is a wild card. And this is, I alluded to this, I said, you know, there he is running around Paris with a razor while Dupin, our narrator, and the jolly ape-napping sailors sit around with loaded pistols and chat about the murder. Who knows what frightful mayhem the ape may commit next, you know. Okay, so the ape is this very rich, symbolic piece of this story. But wait a minute. Did anybody else have a problem with this? The sailor and his friend go, hey, you know what, man, we could make a bunch of money if we catch us an orangutan. Okay? They hold the ape captive. He controls it with a whip, and he keeps it in a closet until he gets around to selling it. Right? Comes back home after a night of drinking, and he finds his captive trying to shave with a razor, which is evidence of intelligence and the ability to imitate. He attempts to beat it, and it escapes. It horribly murders 2 people while he watches, and he doesn't yell for help or anything. He just watches. And here's another point where we see some of the this is another aspect of transgression, which is something that I'm going to talk about. There's this sense of voyeurism, the idea of watching these acts. I mean, you know, he could have been running down the street going, help, help, my ape has escaped. help, help, the orangutan is breaking in. No, not him. He climbs up, you know. I mean, I know he was drunk, but come on. Anyway, so it murders these people, and he just sort of peeks through the window. Oh, look at that. So then he takes off because he's scared. He doesn't tell anybody. You know, I thought I had the murder figured out. I was thinking that he ran in with the group and that he had, you know, had sort of blended in with the crowd or something, but no. So an innocent man gets blamed, but the sailor doesn't do anything. Finally, he thinks he's going to get his captive back. He shows up to claim it and is forced at gunpoint into revealing the truth. Then he goes completely free, not punished. It's not like it was like, what is this? Oops, I did it again. Oh, that pesky orangutan, he vexes me so. There's this. He's he's not punished for what he's done, and in fact, he benefits by it. He makes money, and everybody lives happily ever after, except the ape probably and the two dead ladies. So it's really, really fascinating. I mean, one of the things we see here, I said, you know, this is a place where we can really get a handle on the culture Poe is coming out of, the expectations, the ideas. Now, some of these that I wrote down have to do with what I would call cultural imperialism. That's where you say, not only do you physically invade or take over or colonize or utilize another country as if it was your right to do so, and that's known as imperialism. I'm going to rule over, not only, it's not enough for us to rule over our own country, we also have the right to go out and rule over other countries, okay, or to exploit them in whatever way we feel like we do, okay? But cultural imperialism is the assumption that one's own culture needs to be exported, so that not only are we going to take your ivory and your gold and whatever else you got and your orangutans, we're also going to force you to become like us, something you'll never succeed at, so you'll always be a second-class citizen, but we're going to force you to do it because our way is better. And if you think I'm making this up, I really am not. If you've ever studied any kind of history of the early modern through modern world, you'll see that this is a very human thing to do, and people the world over have done it. But the worldview in this story then includes this assumption that it is perfectly all right for whites to take whatever is wanted from non-Western countries. You may go, well, come on, they just took an orangutan. I got news for you, my friends. If he'd gone over to the neighbors and taken a cow, it would have been a very different story. They would have been mad. You know, he would have gone to jail. Hey, you took my cow. It's my cow. You know, I'm your fellow, I'm your fellow European, and here we live all together, and we all live by the same rules. But because, and let's go back for a second to the thing that I was discussing earlier about the other and the alien. Because what we see as other and alien assume lives outside rules, it's very easy to say, well, they don't have any rules. They don't know about possessions. They're not like us. They don't understand. A great example in our, well, not great, actually a terrible and sad example in our own history is that was one of the things that, one of the ways that when we came to the United States and developed our own culture here, one of the ways we justified taking land away from the Native Americans. We used this thing called manifest destiny. It's our destiny to live here, and they just have to step aside because God wants us here, and that's why we're here. If you haven't gathered this already, I'm simplifying a number of things that deserve their own class and do have them. And I encourage you to study any of this that you find interesting and to add to this discussion. But anyway, it's okay. That's a stunning point of view and a cornerstone of human arrogance. Whether or not Poe, I don't think Poe is necessarily critiquing this here. I don't think he's critiquing it at all. I don't think he's saying, hooray, this is great. I think that he is so immersed in that culture that it's the worldview that comes out. It's what's reflected in this story. And I want to make a big loop away just for a second and say this is the essence of why we look at literature and culture. It's why we put these two things together. Is just to look at what are the assumptions being made here. What do we believe about ourselves? What are our rights? What are our thoughts? Okay. So talking about these assumptions, profiting from what is taken is expected and respected. In other words, at the end, it's okay for this guy to sell the thing he stole and benefit from it because it comes from somewhere else where they don't have rules about that. He didn't really steal it, just as the Nazis didn't really take things from the Jews. They were Jews. They didn't have a right to it. Okay, so I'm making a big deal out of this, and more I'm doing it because we're going to really, as we read the Sherlock Holmes stories, we're going to see this worldview repeated and expanded. Okay, partially because Conan Doyle is a Brit, and the British Empire at the time when Conan Doyle is writing is at, if not the height of its glory, then pretty close to it. Okay. Another thing is human beings have no responsibility to treat animals with kindness. Now, again, I'm going to mitigate this, at least not alien, foreign, vicious animals. And by association, if you go back to the point that I made earlier, what we see is that if you believe that non-Western people are less than human or not completely human, then this has a corollary. It means it's okay. You don't have to treat them as equals. You don't have to, it would be wrong, in fact. I mean, you're not going to invite the orangutan in. Look, the last time he got in, geez, what happened? Okay. So anyway, the other thing is human beings are not responsible when their animals escape and run amok. It's the animal's fault. Never mind. I mean, isn't that a little stunning to you? No, it's not the animal's fault. It's the sailor's fault. He brought the alien and dangerous creature in. Now, he didn't do it with ill intent, but he brought the alien and dangerous creature in, and it was he who created the opportunity for that to occur. But apparently that's not the case. And I would be really interesting to know what other things you see. I'm going to take us down a little bit, and I want to talk a little bit about narrative, which is the way that the story is told, because there's some fascinating things that happen in this story. You may have noticed that there's a big narrative shift from Poe's hand-waving falderal introduction to the quotes from the newspapers, and then again to Dupin's exposition of his reasoning. The story gathers a tremendous amount of narrative force through taking on other voices than the narrators and drawing the reader physically into the story, both through the description of the crime and the attempts to solve it. Further, Poe draws effortlessly on the language of newspaper reportage, police procedure, philosophical discourse, and the speech of common people. He is a ventriloquist for this. Instant we snap to talking about murder itself, it's a completely different story. This isn't wandering around playing, in the streets of Montmartre, playing head games with your best buddy. This is all of a sudden this gripping, and at least for me, I don't have a very strong stomach. You wonder why I'm interested in this kind of literature. This gripping and kind of, stomach-turning murder. I don't know about you, but it's raw enough that you're going, really? So he moves between that and between this elevated type of discourse to kind of taking on the voices, however briefly, of other people and making them seem real enough that we think, oh yes, that we don't even think, well, come on, a shoemaker would never have said that. We don't get to that point. I mean, we think, yeah, okay, this is what people might say. So he's an excellent craftsman. And he introduces all these people, and it's very, very economically. But most, if not all, of these characters including the narrator and Dupin, are simply vehicles to drive plot forward. Another convention for good and ill of many kinds of popular fiction. In other words, Poe had a story he wanted to tell. And he created these characters to tell it. That's their job. Their job isn't to be, they are not the focus of the story. The story is the reason for the characters. And this is, as I just said, and I mentioned earlier, this is one of the hallmarks of a lot of detective fiction. Now, not all, definitely not all, and we're going to read some works where character is absolutely key. But you will notice that only in rare instances do you have a character in a detective novel who doesn't have a role to play. And in general, plot, you know, the running, the shooting, the fighting, the drinking, the loving, that takes precedence over character, over you know, even the consistencies or the minor inconsistencies in the plot, over a whole host of things. But that's not a bad thing. It's just an observation. Is that when we get to detective fiction, the point is to tell a story that's compelling. In the postings that you guys did that the first week called in the Sleuthorama posting, many of you identified the thing that was compelling about detective fiction, what you loved, in those of you who had read it, was the page turning aspect of it. So if you can't even stop, you got to get to the next page. Craftsmanship that might be in a more leisurely paced novel is going to be of less concern. That said, we will encounter some writers who are incredible craftspeople and also great generators of plot. Okay. Now, this next section is called Cherchez la femme, which means find the woman, and it would be remiss not to point out how Murders is a perfect set piece of the Victorian dichotomy between women and men. In the cosmography of traditional middle class, and I really want to stress that, middle class Victorian England. We're not talking about the women who had to go out to work every single day. We're not talking about the super wealthy, although they kind of ascribe to this too. The idea was that men are the doers and the thinkers, the analyzers and the planners. I've alluded to this before. The woman's role was to be, and this is a term from a poet, I mean, it was something that was used all the time. The woman's job was to be the angel in the house. And that's, you're an angel and in the house. So both of those things. You don't go outside, because you don't, if you do that, then you transgress and you leave your proper sphere. Women were supposed to ennoble men who were beasts. Now, I've talked about this before. You know, there's probably a level upon which we could look at this whole story through that lens too, but we won't. A woman's job was to take care of men, to function behind the scenes as a kind of inspiration and model of decorum, a guide to religion, and basically somebody in the background. Raise the children, have the children, raise the children, take care of the house, but all the decision-making power and the power to leave the house, you know, as a public person is left up to men. And this, you know, that's in this story, what do we see? A woman's place is figuratively entombed in the house, sequestered, paralyzed, protected, in quotation marks, and ultimately dead. A woman's place is in the tomb. So kind of. And look at this story. Where are the two women that we see? They are sequestered within their house. They hardly ever go out. Few people know them. In the course of 8 or 10 years, they've seen them like 6 times. There's a woman who goes into their house and does the laundry. Note that, remember I made that class distinction earlier. There have always been women who worked, and always there have been women who applied trades. And a lot of this Victorian construct of separate spheres relies on there being at least some money. But anyway, in contrast, the men that we see are active. They're travelers at will. They can go wherever they want. Individuals who can choose to stay home or go out with complete. By the way, a very interesting sidelight, or a very interesting little mirror effect that you may or may not have noticed is that remember that the narrator and Dupin live alone in a crumbling house, which they rent, and because they don't like to go out during the day, they draw all the curtains and live by candlelight during the day and only go out at night. Well, across town, there are two women who live in a partially abandoned home. They sequester themselves, hardly ever going out by day. We notice that all the windows are covered, except the two at the back. And basically they live in a kind of falling down shack. And there's kind of this fascinating reflection. But the big thing is that Dupin and the narrator can go out and whoop it up and still be respectable. That is not the case with these two women. And they have very few choices about what they can do. Now, all right, so in some ways, I would argue that Murders in the Rue Morgue is a very conservative, a very conservative piece of fiction, in that it reinforces and highlights norms that were existing in the culture. It doesn't suggest that they are bad. There's nothing in there that says, oh, this is a terrible thing, that there's racism and imperialism and sexism. No. Woohoo! Rule Britannia, yay! But at the same time, this story is also, I would suggest, transgressive. And I used this word before, and I'm going to use it a lot. To transgress means to cross a line, to go outside the boundaries of what's seen as normal and acceptable. There are some ways that it is. First of all, there's the open description of death and violence. It isn't that death is not alluded to in plenty of other literature. Some of it horrifying. A little bit later, you'll come to Charles Dickens, who we talked about, that he too has written detective type novels. But the descriptions there are fairly clear too. But this crime is so violent, the crushing and the mangling and the pulling out of the hair and the rending of the garments and the strangling, and it's pretty over the top, and yet it's told in a story and in a context where the readers are put, here it is, it's right in your face. One thing I didn't mention here, and what I should have done, is that I also, the other thing is, I've talked about the various sexual undercurrents in the crime, particularly the idea of the female bodies being examined by different people, and it's the day after the death and they're still lying on the bed. Woohoo! And then, but also this idea of voyeurism, of the pleasure of that we gain pleasure grappling with this other that theoretically we think is so horrible. Oh, murder is terrible, and yet, well, we just can't get enough of it. We love to read these books. This is fascinating. We like to see these movies. We can't look away. We can't look away. And there is this real, the detective novel has a real connection with that thrill and that sense of going where you shouldn't go, and guilt, our own guilt at not being able to look away, at not being simply horrified and just going, well, I'm not going to read about this. Our own guilt about being drawn in. And that's very transgressive, and also what makes this kind and many other kinds of popular fiction so compelling and so interesting. The other way that it's transgressive is that instead of saying the police totally rock, they are the best, if you want this mystery solved, you've got to go to the policeman. In this story, and in many, many other stories, the normal forces of law and order are powerless to solve the crime. And you see that even when the detective is a member of the police force. Think about how many you've seen, how many movies or TV shows you've seen where the detective who really gets the work done is the maverick. He's different somehow, or she's different somehow. She chooses to do things in ways that other people won't. She has freedom. She's outside. She or he is outside of the norm. And again, we see this kind of transgressive subtext, which says solutions to an abnormal problem, an abnormality. Murder isn't something that we do every day, not in our general lives, thank God. But the solution to an abnormal problem has to come from an unorthodox source, from individuals who can, as Poe begins the story by arguing, see differently, see more, and see connections. And I'm going to kind of leave it there because this is a great lead-in to what we're going to be studying with, or what we're going to be seeing in the Sherlock Holmes novels. There is a little bit of romance in the Sherlock Holmes novels when you get to the Baskervilles. It's very sweet. And there's a lot of the things that you may have heard of or have talked about, or may have, glimpsed when you saw some version of the Sherlock Holmes movies. But it's see differently, see more, and see connect.